Tom, David Victor, 35 X-ray.
10-5.
911. I have an overdose victim. All right, what did he overdose on, sir?
As being the leading cause of accidental and preventable death to American citizens. And there's no way for you to buy your way out of it. As a parent, you can't love your way out of it. Instead, we caught him stealing from us and using heroin in our house. And I think at that point, all of us realized these aren't pens. That's a used drug needle. If you didn't know, that is the amount of carfentanil or fentanyl that is required to fatally overdose a human being.
A couple seconds later, he took some steps back and he collapsed.
And ask for naloxone. If they have a stock in supply, they will give it to you for free.
You have the power to save a life. For more information, visit Narcan.com.
So it's literally 10 times worse now than it was when most of us watching this were going to school. It's cataclysmically different for kids that are growing up today.
Stay with me! Stay with me!
It comes down to prevention. We have to prevent it from entering our kids' lives to begin with. And as all these thoughts are swirling through my head, one thought kept coming back. How did I fail you? Welcome one, welcome all. My name is Tim Shoemaker. It is an absolute pleasure for me to start our live stream this evening. Going to be a fun-filled experience, hopefully, for all of us. Errors included. You never know what's going to take place during these things, but I want to welcome you all and thank you for your time here tonight. I also want to thank Englewood for hosting this, the Dwight Morrill School, and Heidi Agramonte, who is the student assistance coordinator or counselor at that school, who's made this possible. Let me just adjust this wire that I have hanging out here, this weird-looking thing. It's going to distract me the entire time if I don't do that, and it's absolutely no better. That doesn't matter. We're going to get rolling. For those of you who are having the pleasure of meeting for the first time, my name is Tim Shoemaker. I'm a frequent keynote and speaker all over the country at different conferences, schools, community events, and beyond on several different topics. And tonight, we're going to be talking about opiate awareness, and we're going to hopefully be protecting you, your loved ones, your community, your staff members, or whomever else you've got joining us here tonight on this very important, pressing topic of opiate abuse and overdose prevention. We've got a lot going on, a lot to share with you here tonight. I want to introduce you to our team, our moderation team that's going to be helping out over the course of the show here. When you send your questions and your comments into us, they're going to be screened by our staff. And tonight, since most of my staff seems to be busy doing other things, we're going to have a guest moderator help us out. His name is Eddie, and Eddie is going to be filtering your comments to make sure that nothing comes through which is inappropriate or in any way embarrassing for your host this evening. Eddie's going to do a great job. He always does, and I think we can count on him to make sure that the evening is entertaining and informative without going across the line. We're going to dive right into our content. While we do, I want you to know that you can send in your questions and your comments live. There's two ways for you to do that. One way is for you to look on the page that you're viewing this live stream on. If that's from the website, timothyshoemaker.com/live, you can just submit your question or comment from typing it into the boxes right below this video here. You'll see it says type your question or comment and then your name. Hit the submit button and it will fly right over to Eddie's iPad and he can check it out for you. If you're viewing on a device and or you're directly through YouTube for the stream, then what you can do is email directly to tim@timothyshoemaker.com. You see that message on your screen right there below the radar with the email address, and that'll also go to Eddie. He'll take a look at it, and when he's done with his banana, he'll make sure that it gets forwarded to me for comment. Also, if there's any providers here or resources that want to join in any way, if we can accommodate that, I will include it. And that's about it. As I pause one more time to try to adjust this pesky wire here that's going to drive me berserk. And I think what I really need is a roll of duct tape. So we're going to try to just screen that out of my consciousness. Guys, it's terrible for me to have to review the fact that as we speak here tonight, The CDC and the Surgeon General refers to fatal drug overdoses, drug use in general, as being the leading cause of accidental and preventable death to American citizens. That has changed a lot. I know that if you've been alive and present for decades, drug use has always been an omnipresent issue, and we've always been concerned about it as parents, preventionists, I should say, counselors, teachers, and beyond. But a lot of us grew up at a different era. I, for example, was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and that's when I was in school and high school. And we knew we had a problem with drugs back in the 80s and 90s, but our problem, as bad as it was about 9,000 fatal drug overdoses a year. And today, as I cast this stream across the world, we're experiencing over 100,000 fatal drug overdoses every year in America. We've been doing that for several years now. There's no sign that that's going to slow down or be abated in any way. So it's literally 10 times worse now than it was when most of us watching this were going to school. It's cataclysmically different for kids that are growing up today. And if you're just joining this presentation and you haven't immersed yourself in the fallout from our nation's battle against substance abuse, you wouldn't know it, because today, although we're connected in ways that we haven't been in the past, we're not getting access to information on this topic the way we would in the past. It's not an issue that is going to filter through to your kids on Instagram or TikTok. You're certainly not going to see it on Google. It's not going to be pushed into your consciousness because we just don't have resources to do that. And the companies that are profiting off of our nation's failure in this regard are working very, very hard to put up a firewall between their products or the future use of their products, the proliferation of their products, recreational substances, and anyone that would rise up against it or try to deter the next generation from following in the terrible footsteps of this current generation and the one that is now in their 20s and 30s. So I just need all of you to be aware of how pressing this fact is, how terrible the situation is for our kids today, our communities today, and indeed our nation today as we come together tonight here to try to address one small part of it. And I want to commend you and thank you for being here to do that. We want to help our kids, and we want them to accomplish their hopes, dreams, goals, and aspirations, but they're not going to be able to do that if they make a mistake and take a misstep down the road of recreational substance abuse. So every day in America now, we are experiencing 300 fatal overdoses in regards to drug abuse. 300 lives lost, friends, neighbors, mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters disappearing because they traveled down the wrong path of recreational substance abuse. And it's a mistake that doesn't have to happen. Society, culture, and commerce are going to try to push that to continue happening. But we can stop that, and hopefully we will here tonight. It's sad for us to review the fact that today fentanyl-related overdoses are so popular, so commonplace for youth and teenagers. And a lot of the times it's not the youth that are using the fentanyl, but it's a family member or it's a neighbor or they encounter it out in public. And these substances are so deadly that just coming into casual contact with them can cause fatal overdoses. And so that's another reason why we're coming together here tonight, because there's some environmental awareness that you may need to be increasing your knowledge on to protect yourself and your loved ones from just coming into contact with these things. As I'll review with you over the course of our presentation, I come into contact with drug refuse, drug garbage, the leftovers, and such on a regular basis when I'm out in public. And I'm not always traveling in places that maybe would be stereotypical of drug use. I don't think today there is a stereotypical area for drug use. And so whether you live in what you believe to be a beautiful area or a less than beautiful area, you need to be careful. And tonight we're going to go over some reasons why and some methods that you can use. It's a sad fact as well that the number one cause of fatal overdoses, fatal poisonings, I should say, for youth, for children, is opiates today. Once again, just a consequence of the increasing use and abuse of opiates in our society, in our homes and communities, is that once kids find their way into these things, once they find them strewn about or get access to them, sometimes they experiment. Sometimes they don't even think that it's a drug. They think it's candy of some type, and that's causing an alarming number of deaths. And then, of course, we have those that are unintentionally abusing a recreational substance. And I'm going to use that to apply to someone who maybe wants to indulge in a Xanax or some type of a prescription medicine that they were either prescribed at one point for an injury or for an anxiety or some form of mental illness, but they're no longer being prescribed that medicine. And so they might try to borrow one from a friend, steal one from a parent, or buy one on the black market. These pills that are present on the black market oftentimes contain fish hooks. Not a metal fish hook, but a drug fish hook. What the people selling these drugs want is a repeat customer. And so if they can make their pill, their version of Xanax, hit just a little harder than the dealer down the street, they might add a little fentanyl or other products to it that makes that pill feel different than what the user has felt before. And sometimes they're not too careful with how much they put in. And so today we have the terrifying prospect of a child experimenting with what they believe to be a prescription substance that might have been diverted from the normal flow of prescription medications, but in fact it's a fictitious fraudulent pill that's been manufactured to look the same, stamped and transported across our nation for sale on the black market, but it actually contains terrible and potentially fatal substances such as fentanyl, carfentanil, or other forms of synthetic opiates. And so this is, again, an issue that we see it attacking us in so many ways. And my friends, if you have not, to this point, come into contact with a used drug needle while walking your dog or walking through a park or after parking your car in a parking lot, you're just not looking. And I understand why many people wouldn't do that. If you haven't been burglarized or been the victim of a theft because of a neighbor or someone traveling through the area is trying to support their drug habit, the day is coming. I show you the picture right here because it's a terrible circumstance. The security camera that is in this man's office caught this man, this contractor, whom was in his house for lawful purposes. He was repairing something in the bathroom. The security camera caught this man stealing things from the man's office. And I guess the intent was to convert those things to cash so that he could support his heroin addiction. In this case, the security camera also caught that man, that contractor, while no one was home, shooting up heroin in his house. And the picture is being taken here about 3 feet away from his daughter's bedroom, 5 feet away from his son's bedroom, and just 2 feet away from his own bathroom. The tragedy of this picture is that's my house. I don't trust anybody to be in my house unattended. And so when we put the security cameras up, we thought that the worst thing we would catch is maybe a contractor overbilling us or being a little bit lazy. But instead we caught him stealing from us and using heroin in our house. And had I not installed a security camera there, we never would have known any of that. In fact, at one point, the substance that he was using was on the desk, just sitting on the desk that I normally put my ham sandwich on when I'm paying my bills. I never would have known that if I hadn't installed a camera there. So these things tend to take place out of plain sight, but they are occurring all around us at all times. It's very important for everyone to be aware of it because the risks that we're going to talk about here tonight do stand to affect every single one of us. And if you know it or not, they already are. 110,000 fatal overdoses for something like fentanyl, heroin, OxyContin, other forms of opiate or prescription medicines is a terrible number. As I mentioned, 10 times higher than it was just a few decades earlier with no sign of slowing down at this point. I do want to pause here to mention that some good news is that most of our children will not get into opiate use, abuse, or addiction. Most of our kids are going to trip up over some other type of a drug, such as marijuana today, which is the number one reason that young kids, adolescents, and young adults are entering treatment, recovery, and rehabilitation programs for cannabis use disorder. By far and away the number one cause of drug-induced problems amongst that cohort of kids, or alcohol or nicotine. And if you were not aware of the fallout from those substances, I just want to compare for you the tragic effects, the terrifying effects, the heart-stopping effects, literally and figuratively, of losing someone instantaneously due to a sudden opiate overdose. There's very little comparison to that. But because so many more people use the substances of alcohol, it shouldn't surprise you that a lot more people die every year because they've overused alcohol. In fact, in the same year that we will lose 110,000 people from fatal drug overdoses due to opiates, we'll lose 170,000 of our friends, neighbors, family members because they overused alcohol. And if we were to extend that statistic to nicotine, the number one, by far and away, deadliest drug in America also happens to be, right now, about the most common drug in America. That number climbs to 480,000. That's not a cumulative number. That's the amount of Americans that the CDC estimates are killed every single year as a result of an exposure to nicotine that occurred years or decades ago, but manifests in health symptoms that take their life today. So if you were to put your finger on some of these numbers, which sound absolutely staggering, it's important to note that this is far and away the biggest threat to you, your family, your children. You know, we all buckle up in the car, but 43,000 people are going to be killed this year in car crashes compared to the 110,000, 170,000, or 480,000 due to their exposure to those drugs. About 20,000 people are killed in America every year from criminal gun violence. Again, pale in comparison. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years, 2 decades, in that terrible war where we sent, our sons and daughters off. 2,500 of those brave Americans were killed while fighting in Afghanistan. 2,500 over 2 decades of war. And compare that to the risks that we face each and every day as a result of our exposure to recreational substance abuse. As I say that, it seems to be a stark contrast to the level of public awareness that is there and to the level of public alarm, I would say the concern and the deliberate efforts that we see being invested to prevent our kids from following down that fatal funnel of recreational substance abuse. But it's a fact. And we are in a different time, in a different place right now. And we're not going to change that. Probably not on a county level, probably not on a state level, certainly not on a national level or a cultural level. But I have seen, and I do believe that we can change that on a familial level, your kids, your family, your house, and on a community level, in your community. It can change. And 2 communities that exist directly next to each other have extraordinarily different drug use patterns. I see that every day. I'm in different schools every single day, different communities, and it's alarming, the differences that I see between 2 different communities. And so we can accomplish that should we wish to. We have to acknowledge that these things together, accumulate more deaths than suicide, heart disease, and cancer. And it's very hard to prevent heart disease or cancer. It's very hard to predict, who is going to fall victim to the fatal or life-altering consequences of heart disease or cancer. The good news is with substance abuse, it's 100% preventable. So we all like to have some good news, and I want you to know that if you can get your kid to 18 or 21 years without experimenting with recreational substance abuse, they have an almost zero chance of ever falling victim to it. It's because the attitudes, norms, beliefs, and behaviors that we establish during our teen and adolescent years, they predict our future use patterns. And if we can get our kids to those ripe old ages of 18, God willing, to 21, a less than 3% chance for the rest of their life of ever suffering from abuse, addiction, or overdose. That's a pretty good goal. And to be honest with you, I believe it's a goal that we can accomplish, especially if we come together. So that preamble notwithstanding, I want to tell you about the typical timeline that goes on when it comes to recreational substance abuse, because it may be very helpful for you. You may have kids of different ages, or perhaps, your role in life is with a specific cohort of kids. And obviously, we use very different tactics and techniques to keep kids of different ages safe. Now, kids that are under the years old of 12, under the age of 12, I should say, stumble over my own tongue there, have almost no interest in substance abuse. And the kids that we find abusing substances under the age of 12 have staggering environmental problems, or when it comes to predispositions, they're very unique. And I would say that they are definitely outliers, and they typically don't fall through the cracks because their behavior on the macro level typically draws a lot of attention. So between 0 and 12 years old, the most important thing for parents, caregivers, and mentors in the community is to demonstrate a zero-use policy for kids to understand that just the fact that you get older doesn't mean that you have to use alcohol to relax at night or to have fun while you're watching football. It's actually a big deal, and there's been several studies on this that demonstrate the mentorship that kids see between 0 and 12 is a strong predictor of their future use, abuse, overdose patterns as they get older. Drugs tend to get out of control, and one of the first places that they get out of control is when kids look up to someone in their life, a friend, a family member, or a mentor of other kinds, and find that that person requires or just habitually uses substances to relax, or to have fun, to be social, to enjoy themselves. Between 0 and 12, those kids need to know that it can be done without the use of recreational substances. That's giving them the best chance that they have. And that's, of course, typically easy for us to do. In general, most people are very careful about using substances around 0 to 12-year-olds, but not everyone is, and I want to make sure that you know the best practice there. Around 13, things begin to change, right? Kids get into that 8th grade level, and specifically that freshman year of high school. And if we want to drill down even more, The data shows us that between September and December of their freshman year of high school, very, very big game changer for kids, they begin to get mixed messages about drugs, specifically because they're hanging out with older kids, doing older things. Supervision is a little less at that point. Different things are expected of them. And that is when we see some of these outside influences combining with natural teenage curiosities, maturation, boundary testing, curiosities, and beyond. And so it's completely normal and natural to see a 13 to 15-year-old begin to get curious about these things. I endorse it. I welcome it. I think it's a wonderful time for us to help guide, mold, and to some degree manipulate their perceptions and expectations when it comes to substance abuse. This is certainly not the time to be turning a blasé eye to the initiation of some vaping behavior or some drinking behavior. Again, the studies on this are extraordinarily clear. This is when we need to double down with our conversations, with our influence, with our guidance in this matter to try to provide as many examples as possible to help steer them away. Understand the temptation, understand the peer pressure, understand the curiosity, and understand the very many uses that people have for recreational drugs. To take something a dose at a time to just make your day get better. Feel a little bit better, forget your worries and your troubles, right? You can either take something a dose at a time to make that go away, or you can build yourself up from the inside out and learn how to deal with those things and gain control of your life without relying upon some type of an external influence. Listen, as a life skill, it's essential, but it's more important for kids between 13 and I'm going to go on to 18 years old here. That prefrontal cortex in their brain is still growing and maturing. And rather than simply learning the self-efficacy, those internal assets that they need in order to become a productive, resilient human being later on in life, we got to be careful because the introduction of substances like nicotine in particular or alcohol in particular during those teenage years, it might prevent them from ever developing solid decision-making skills, rationality, and judgment because those substances have been specifically shown to harm the developing prefrontal cortex, which is what we rely upon to make sound judgment and predictive reasoning in the future. So we want to keep these things out of our kids' lives, not simply because we don't want them engaging in that and other risky behaviors, but because we want to give them a fighting chance to be a productive adult later on. Some of them will not get that chance, no matter how bad they need it, because during the teenage years, they will be impairing a part of their brain that is never going to recover and is never going to mature and grow into what it was meant to be. So then we have the honeymoon period, and this is again where we need to continue our efforts to prevent, guide, and mold with our kids as much as is possible. And as big as an obstacle that seems to be, it is possible. And especially if we work together, we can prevent drug use from becoming normalized. Once a 15 to 18-year-old begins to normalize substance abuse for recreation or for relaxation, either one of those things, it's going to get hardwired into their life. And although use patterns for some can decrease as they get older, there are a lot of kids that have either a genetic predisposition or they just, unfortunately, are very vulnerable to diving into a substance which is known to be chemically addictive and which is tragically something that will pull them down a dark hole at some point. The day's going to come where they celebrate a little too hard or they have a really bad day and they go over the top. And as I'm going to show you in a few minutes here, it was very easy for that to happen to even the best of us at any stage of our life. And so important for us to double down during the 15 to 18 years. Now, after 18, it's a different story, and specifically after 21, if you didn't know, those benchmarks of 18 and 21, 18 is where a lot of our studies come from. Across the globe, that is a cohort of kids, pre and post 18-year-old with it. The studies tend to use as a bright line. But 21, the age of 21 as the drinking age in America in particular, it's evidence-based, if you weren't aware. And that evidence-based determination of the age of 21 being a safer age for someone to indulge in alcohol use, that's been reaffirmed time and time again for several decades now. Cognitively, neurologically, the brain isn't ready for it before then, for various different reasons. After 21, the damage that can be done to the then mature brain, it's far less. Your brain is much less vulnerable to the impositions of a toxin and carcinogen like alcohol or another neurotoxin and addictive chemical like nicotine. And so, once we get our kids to that level, would I be happy that they're using? No, of course not. But it's a much smaller threat to their life, their future, and to the development. So our first impressions matter, my friends. As you all know, we form our drug use expectations and we base our behavior, somewhat upon expectation theory. drawing upon our first impressions. And so for those of you who don't know any of my backstory, give you a really brief intro to the backstory. One of the first experiences that I had with substance abuse outside my home happened in the 5th grade when I went to elementary school one morning that was just like any other morning. And I want to introduce you to that circumstance now, just so you get an idea of why I am here speaking to you about this topic. So I was like 10 years old. I'm in the 5th grade. And one morning my mom drops me off in front of this beautiful school. And I went running to the back of the school like I did every single day to play with kids before the bell rang for homeroom, you know. And I found my buddies. They were hanging out around this picnic table and they were playing with these pens that somebody had left behind like the day before. So I pull up and I start playing with the pens too. They were cool looking. I hadn't seen them, something like that before. And one of my buddies picks up a pen and he kind of throws it at me, laughing, and I grab it and I go to throw it back at him and I realize that my hand is stinging. And I look down at my hand and this pen is sticking out of my hand, you know, kind of like a dart in a dartboard. And I think at that point all of us realized these aren't pens, that's a used drug needle. So one of the first opportunities I had, one of the first interactions that I had in the outside world, in public, was with an accidental prick of a hypodermic syringe that had been left behind on the picnic table at my elementary school. If you're not aware, that's not an extraordinary circumstance. Across the nation, it's a continuing problem. And that was in the 80s and 90s. It's far worse today than it's ever been. Persons who are using drugs oftentimes do go to school playgrounds in particular to use their drugs. It's well known by the janitors at every school, I would imagine. It's one of those places that is just a mecca for substance abuse. I guess given typically these playgrounds are dark, they have places to hide, they're not frequented by a lot of people, and it just happens to be a place where these things are discarded quite frequently. Public parks are another one. Parking lots, again, are a third. And it's important for us to have a conversation with our kids as young as is possible about the possible dangers, especially today where use rates are so high and this garbage is being left all over the place. The stakes are alarming. And so in your community, no matter where that community is, this is an issue. This is a problem. And so one of the things that we talked about with kids today, as difficult as it is safety around sharp objects such as needles that can be discarded and are being discarded quite frequently in public places, because the day that they come into contact one, if they don't know what they're looking at or dealing with, they would end up just like me. And every year it happens quite frequently to kids across the country being exposed. In some cases, 20 at a time. You saw that article there where these kids were playing, they found it on the playground recently, and they were just playing with it amongst themselves. 20 kids, elementary school kids at one playground, ended up getting pricked with a used hypodermic syringe. And so it's a morbid topic. It's a dark thing to discuss, but it's really important for us to go over with our kids. And I'm going to tell you what they need to know in a moment here. When I was exposed to it, I mentioned to you, it was 1985, and that was a very different time. Those of you who are alive in 1985, you remember that the needles in our communities was a big thing. It was on posters, PSAs. You turn on any one of the 6 channels that we had back in the day, and you would see, advertisements, PSAs, and warnings about coming into contact with needles. And so when I was pricked at 10 years old, I was told by the nurses at the time that I would have to get tested for the next 10 years of my life because that could have injected a virus into my body that could lay dormant for at least a decade before it actually was testable. That was horrifying for me. And of course, it made a very big impression on me because for 10 years, I thought that one time I'm going to go in there and take the test and it's going to be positive. Terrible weight to cast over your shoulders, specifically as a young kid and, into middle school and high school when I would start dating and the like. Clearly, it didn't come back positive, and that wasn't the last time I'd be pricked by a needle, which is tragic to say. Been exposed to bloodborne pathogens on numerous occasions. It was never fun. It never gets less scary or frightening, and the treatment is never any less intrusive. So these are what needles look like, and I'm going to hold up one for you. Here is a needle in my hand, and you can see why kids think that they're pens. And the picture that I have there, let me just see if I can make this bigger for you guys. In the picture that you see there, the needles are. So I'll hold a pen up on top of this, and you can see Everything's reversed from my view here, so I feel a little bit clumsy showing you this. But you can see they look exactly like pens. But the problem is that the needle tip obviously can be fatal. Just a simple little prick. And the needles prick very easily through the cap that is on the needle itself. There's a little shroud there, but it does very little. The needle is very easy to push through there. In fact, over the course of my career, I've watched several people stick themselves. These are trained professionals. I've watched them stick themselves with needles. In one case, I was watching an employee package a needle in a sharps container like this, and he knew that the needle was infected. He knew that it was not something that he wanted to have contact with, so he was being careful. But as he was placing it into the sharps container, he missed and pricked himself with the needle. So my advice to you, to all the kids in your life, is to have the conversation. Show them. If they ever come in contact with the needles, that they shouldn't touch it at all. In fact, if it's on a playground, even if you're an adult, I would recommend finding someone that's responsible for that area and letting them pick it up and deal with it, because it's something that presents a morbid danger, and it's important for us to know just situational awareness. I live in New Jersey, and our local hockey team is the New Jersey Devils, and so their stadium is in a town called Newark. And not long ago, I took my family into Newark to see a Devils game, and we were at a relatively nice restaurant nearby. And when we went into the bathroom stalls, after eating at the restaurant, there was a hypodermic syringe and some leftover baggies of drugs just sitting in that bathroom stall right next to the hockey stadium, which is something that you wouldn't expect to see. But again, this is happening all around us now, and we don't want to take a chance on kids coming into contact with this kind of stuff. Not knowing what it is or how deadly it can be, how it can affect their lives. So one of the most basic truths of life that I think is so important for adults and kids to understand is something that if you've been on the planet for a couple decades, you've long since come to grips with. And that's the fact that no matter how successful you are in your life, no matter how precious life is to you, no matter where you've come from and where you've arrived at, drugs are uniquely capable of destroying everything that you've worked for in your life. And there's no way for you to buy your way out of it. As a parent, you can't love your way out of it. Once recreational substance abuse enters your life and turns into abuse and addiction, the effects are shortly behind. And so prevention here is key. You certainly can't arrest your way out of this problem, but arresting people for this and protecting the community and getting them into treatment forcibly is very important. You can't treat your way out of the problem. The cure rate, long-term cure rate, when I say long-term, guys, I'm saying 6 months to a year. The long-term cure rate for addiction is extraordinarily poor. If you didn't know, you can go to one of the best rehabilitation clinics, recovery centers in America, and the prognosis for being clean, it's short-lived. Addiction is something that we have not yet figured out how to fix, how to cure, how to move beyond. And so once it's there, it's a big deal. It's a big problem. And no matter how much resources we throw towards rehabilitation, treatment, we're never going to treat our way out of this problem. It comes down to prevention. We have to prevent it from entering our kids' lives to begin with. And for those of us who believe that that's not possible, I invite you to come a little bit towards my direction. Not only is it possible, but it should happen, and it's probable if we focus on it together. So if you look around today, unlike in the 80s and 90s, when you were constantly faced with another celebrity, another athlete, another actor of some type, politician whose life was destroyed by substances, and it was plastered all over the media. Today, it still happens, probably much more frequently than it did in the past, but it's kind of, you kind of have to dig for the details, and that's just the way that we are. It's a consequence of those who are in control of the media and what they feel is news or should be news. Another part of it is dog bites man is not a story because it happens so frequently, but man bites dog becomes the big story. Well, people dying from substance abuse or having their lives destroyed by it, it's just such a common thing now. Sometimes we forget that our kids might not have come to that conclusion. And so it's important that when life, culture, or society gives us an example, that we make sure our kids are aware of it. And Liam Payne is one of the most recent examples. He's relatively beloved amongst most high school kids and college-age kids today. And he's a great example of how you can be a gifted person. You can have access to all the women that you would like, whatever car you want to drive, you can buy it. Wherever you want to go on vacation, you can afford to do it. In many ways, I'm sure that Liam Payne reached the end of the rainbow and found his pot of gold. I think most of you would agree. And yet, at the ripe old age of 31, he's dead now because of his exposure to drugs, when he was younger. No matter how good his life got, the fatal consequences of that brush with drugs eventually caught up with him. And we see not just the fatal mistakes, but the absolutely preventable and somewhat embarrassing mistakes that we all find in our daily lives as well. Justin Timberlake was recently arrested for DWI at the age of 43 years old. And you have to ask yourself, if you were Justin Timberlake and you were in a bar or a restaurant and you realize that maybe you've had a little too much, do you have any options available to you? Have you ever heard that drunk driving could be potentially fatal to you or some innocent bystander? The consequences could be severe. Most of us, you would hope, could come to the conclusion that you can raise your hand and ask for a ride home. I'm betting that Justin Timberlake would have no shortage of people willing to help him out there. Or maybe pick up your phone and order an Uber, which I think he could probably afford. But under the influence of drugs, Justin Timberlake thought that everything was fine. He was overconfident, overindulgent, and as a result, lucky for everybody, he was stopped by a police officer and arrested before anything more terrible than that happened. And I think that it's a great demonstration of how badly drugs can affect us of all walks of life and how irrelevant your success in life becomes. Again, once we start the timer on the consequences of drug use in our life, that alarm's going to go off at some point. And our ability to control that, not just the timing, but the onset of that consequence, it's very low, very hard to control. And that's just, we're talking about arrest and death, but can you imagine all the harmful things that are said, the harmful deeds that are done, the big mistakes that are made, the useless money that is spent or wasted on things as a result of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs? It is an anchor around the chain, an anchor around the ankle of just about every person. And we could go all day long talking about the well-known celebrities, again, that have many of the things that we and our kids would like in life, the material accoutrement that we would want to bring into our lives. And we can readily acknowledge how so many of them end up paying the price and the consequence, not for their lack of resources or accomplishment, but for, unfortunately, the lack of sobriety in their lives. And somehow, I think in some circles, we've allowed ourselves to view sobriety as a negative thing. It certainly isn't. If you look in your life, almost everybody watching this broadcast has someone that they love, care about, or at least respected, has suffered, or maybe even died as a result of substance abuse of one type or another. And all of us, if we think about the people who are close to us, and we allow ourselves to imagine the worst that we have ever seen those people, when they were at their worst, in almost all cases, it was after they had indulged too much in some type of a recreational substance. And so, listen, there's a lot to lose here by getting involved in it, and there's a lot to gain for not. And so, again, I'm belaboring this point here because I know that there's some people that are, I think, nice enough to have joined us here tonight. And I want to make sure that I leave you with some of the most important and most effective tidbits of information that I could bestow upon you, and I'm going to reinforce it multiple times. Your example means a lot, and it's the little decisions that ultimately end up in the culmination of our life, our choices. So, like when I was younger, growing up, I told you about the incident where I was pricked by needles. That wasn't my only exposure to drugs when I was younger. My family did not have everything it needed when I was younger. There were stresses and impositions. There was, unfortunately, some traumatic incidents that happened to me and my other family members. And so we struggled quite a bit. And growing up, I was constantly reminded that substance abuse made all of your problems worse and very quickly became, if not a big problem, the biggest problem in the lives of those that I loved, and ended up removing so many of the ones that I loved from their mentorship role in my life. And there was a point at which I, had a very negative view on substance abuse simply because I watched it destroy so many of those that I love. And I didn't want to become that. I didn't want to let that in. And I also reached a point in my life where I realized if I don't learn how to stand on my own 2 feet, and if I try to move forward, starting from basically, day one, at my 18th birthday, I wasn't going to be inheriting anything. I wasn't going to be stepping into a future or traveling down a road that was already paved for me. I was going to be, heading out into the world. I really couldn't afford to be dragging around any liabilities that I couldn't avoid. And so, for me, I had made the decision to be drug-free from a very early on, and I'm in a category of about 40 to 45% of the people out there who just decided when they were younger not to use recreational drugs. And although I made a lot of mistakes and I'm not an especially talented person, things have turned out okay for me. And I don't think that would have been the case if I decided to mess around with alcohol, tobacco, or other drugs when I was younger. It's one of the few things that I did do right. But my life wasn't easy. I had a lot of temptations, curiosities, and excuses to use drugs, the same thing most people have. I had suffered several traumatic brain injuries. I turned into a terrible student as a result of learning disabilities. I had trouble keeping up with the other kids. I lost the ability to play sports as well as I did and loved to at one point because, again, took a couple conks to the head. Lived in a tough environment for a while as my family struggled, and as they dealt with their issues, again, I watched some of my family members medicate themselves and try to take the edge off of the tough times by turning to recreational substances. And again, that was something that affected everybody else. It just synergistically amplified the problem. So luckily, I can look back on those times and I can, proudly proclaim that if it wasn't for those times, I would be a mess today. If life was easy back then, I never would have learned the tough lessons that I needed to learn anyway to forge a new path for myself. And it wasn't easy, but I'm really glad that it happened. And it actually became a turning point for me around 15, 16, 17, when my life choices began to contrast against those of my peer group that were in my friend group, my immediate friend group. And I want to show you how that took place and what I ended up doing there. Anyway, my family began to fall apart. And so I spent a lot of my time out and about with my friends. My friends were older than me, and by the time I was 16, most of those friends were using drugs. I don't think that's an uncommon thing today either. At 16, whatever, I didn't care. I figured these were kids that were hanging out and having a good time the same way that their parents hung out and had a good time when they were younger. But within 2 short years, I lost 2 of those friends to the drug use. One from an overdose, and the other was arrested for dealing drugs. And I remember thinking at the time that I could have been with them, and that would have kind of put the lid on my life at that point. So I'm 18 now, and I know that I'm not doing well. My life isn't heading in a good direction, and I need to make a move. As a lot of 18-year-olds begin to feel, I'm thinking I need to take my life in a new direction right now. And under the influence of that impulse, I did something really foolish. I became a cop. What you want, what you want, what you gonna do? So there I am. I became the fuzz, and it was my job, it was my role at that point to go and start trying to fix this thing. I wanted to fix our problem with substance abuse. And at first, like I think most young people would try to do, I wanted to arrest my way out of it, or at least try to address anyone who was selling it, anybody who was transporting it, anybody who was using it in an inappropriate way. I wanted to find them, catch them, and put handcuffs on them. And I did that very aggressively for several years. And at one point, of course, kind of like the guy throwing starfish back into the water, you have to begin to question if you're really making a difference. And although I was fairly certain in several cases that we were making a difference there, I needed to make more of a difference. And I started to consider, can we get in front of it? Can we start helping kids understand that there's another path, that they don't have to follow the group or the popular kids or those that are promoting that in society? The answer was yes. And in our community, I began going into the schools, and I got an assignment where I could spend a lot of my time in the schools teaching kids, mentoring kids, running volunteer programs, and helping to shape and mold attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors in another direction. And I did that for the next several decades, ultimately traveling across the country. But for a while, spending my time in one community of about 15,000 people, and we saw dramatic change within that community, refreshing change on the community level, parents, kids, institutions, and systems that were there in support. And it was a very rewarding time for me, and I think for so many. And as we spent more than a decade doing that, we got to the point where some of the kids that we had been teaching since they were 5 years old would come up and say that they had learned important lessons that maybe they didn't swallow sweetly the first time they heard them, but as they got older and they saw some of the negative consequences affecting their friends, they weren't affected by it, and they were happy that they had gone through it, and they were, giving us some of the credit for them staying drug-free and not falling victim to any of the circumstances. And as we began to make progress in that regard, and I began to believe more and more in the significance and effectiveness of prevention-based efforts to prevent substance abuse, use, and then ultimately addiction and overdose. All of a sudden it took a turn for the worse. And around 2010, a new crisis kind of entered the scene. And whereas, with alcohol, marijuana, or nicotine, oftentimes if you're alert and if you're paying attention, and if you're committed and willing to do the hard work that needs to be done, you can catch it with kids, and you can address it. And it can turn into a learning opportunity if you catch it early and you work to address it. Not really the case with opiates. Opiates are oftentimes instantly fatal. And if they're not instantly fatal, the fatality tends to happen relatively quickly. Although I did know people who were able to use opiates for years or even more than that, most people can't. And that bad trip, that bad hit is kind of right around the corner. And I began seeing some of the kids that I was trying to protect, some of the kids that I did truly love and care for so much, fall victim to opiate abuse and sudden overdose and deaths. And so the next phase of our presentation tonight will describe kind of the moment when I realized that no matter what I was doing, it just seemed like it wasn't enough. And that became part of the motivation for starting this course called The Second Too Late.
The first time I just a minute, you're back up a ride.
500 Doddridge, Tom, David, Victor, 35 X-ray.
So far.
911. I have an overdose victim. All right, what did he overdose on, sir?
11-10-4.
I became a police officer in 1995, and for the first 10 years of my career, I didn't go to a single opiate overdose. It never happened. It was not a common thing. Really anywhere in the country, our fatal overdoses at that point were sub 10,000 nationwide. But by 2020, our fatal overdoses had increased more than 10 times, and we were losing well over 100,000 people a year to fatal overdoses. And in my world of law enforcement, they had become routine.
I think it was heroin. Heroin? Yes. How old is he? 18 years old. 18 years old? All right, sir, is he breathing or not? I need to know. Yeah. Stop breathing. Hush. Stop breathing.
As I was running up towards the house, I could hear the family screaming inside, and I ran right past them, into the bedroom, rolled them over, knew instantly that it was an opiate overdose, and I knew that if I could detect a pulse, I could save his life, I could bring him back, so I checked for the pulse. There was no pulse. We found him too late. I know at this point that there is nothing that I can do to save this kid's life. And I'm looking down at him, and time has just stopped. And that's when I realized that I knew him. The family that was softly crying in the other room now, I knew them all by their first names. I had taught their children when they were younger, and our families had become close. I had seen his younger sister just a day prior downtown, like goofing off with her friends, smiling, laughing, not a care in the world, and all that has changed now in an instant.
Stay with me. Stay with me.
And as all these thoughts are swirling through my head, one thought kept coming back. How did I fail you?
So that program is why we are here tonight, to try to make sure that that stops happening. And tragically, I've since lost more kids that I knew since that was filmed, and I want to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone that you care about. And so we're going to go over what the opiates look like. I showed this slide a little bit earlier. I think the most dangerous form that everyone needs to be concerned about is that powdered form that you see there. So easy for that powder to get kicked up into the air, for it to touch a mucous membrane. And if that was to get on to your body, in your nose, in your eyes, or in your mouth, the fatal overdose can happen absolutely instantly. If you are not a person that has been using opiates for some time and graduated up to that level, you have no tolerance. Very quick and easy to be overdosed fatally. The pills that you see there are various different forms of opiate painkillers, that some of which are prescription and some of which are just manufactured pills, like the rainbow pills there, that are laced with nitrazine, dilaudid, fentanyl, heroin, carfentanil, various different forms of synthetic opiates, in particular the ones that are so deadly today. And if you didn't know, that is the amount of carfentanil or fentanyl that is required to fatally overdose a human being. I'm 200 pounds, and if that amount, that's a real penny there. If that amount of fentanyl or carfentanil or nitrazine now, which is becoming even more common and is more potent, was to make its way onto one of my mucous membranes, that would be it. And if Narcan wasn't immediately by, there would be little hope of saving my life. I would go into respiratory distress and ultimately respiratory failure from just that small amount. That's how critical, how dangerous this stuff is. Of course, the needles we went over before, but it's important for you to be aware that that is all it takes. So knowing that it's out there, in case you ever see it, knowing that it's something that needs to be addressed immediately. If the opiate abuse starts with a pill, for instance, or if it starts with some type of a painkiller, or if you notice that someone we love is going back for more and more prescriptions of high dose, high potency painkillers, we want to start getting help sooner rather than later. And to be honest with you, we want to try to avoid opiate-based painkillers as much as is possible, and that will help keep those that we love safe. Better at it than much. I'm going to show you how quickly a person can overdose on this. The video that you're about to see is of a police officer, and he's conducting an arrest, and during the arrest, he found what appeared to be some drugs on the person, and some of the drugs were a white powdery form, and he took the drugs, again, a trained professional, back to his police car to perform a test to figure out what type of drugs those were. And as he did so, he disturbed the drugs that he was testing, and a very small amount of them wafted up into the air and without his knowledge ended up touching his mucous membranes. And watch how fast he overdoses once he comes into contact with this stuff.
In Five Ives' case, the exposure and his reaction to it was almost instant.
A couple seconds later, he took some steps back and he collapsed.
Corporal Crane was equipped with the nasal spray Narcan, a prescription medicine that rapidly reverses the effects of an overdose. Still, Five Eye needed more. Here he is, in his own words, still emotional.
My lungs just locked up. I couldn't breathe. I was trying to gasp for breath, but I couldn't breathe at all.
Five Eye, you okay? Talk to me. You're okay. Don't be sorry. There's nothing to be sorry about.
That's how fast it can happen, and if Narcan is not right there to save his life, and that's not a happy ending to that story. And the videos of professionals, police officers coming into contact with opiates in the field and that happening to them, they're all over the internet. The stories are unfortunately tragic and plentiful. So now that you've seen it, you know how serious the effects are and how quickly they can affect us. Now, the Narcan, the naloxone that was used to save that man's life is available today. I'm speaking to you from New Jersey. Both federal and state resources have been siphoned in this area as some harm reduction methods have been enacted to try to help us stave the fatal overdoses. And if we can't stop people from using the opiates yet, maybe we could be there to save them when something goes wrong. Intervening in an overdose is risky, and the best advice is to always call 911 so that you are not inadvertently exposed to some of the drugs that the person overdosed on. You can't guarantee that that cannot happen, but if you are in an area where a loved one, a family member, or in the public, when someone appears to be experiencing an opiate overdose and you feel comfortable, you personally feel safe trying to administer an overdose recovery drug such as naloxone or Narcan, you can get this drug almost anywhere today for free, anonymously. Most restaurants will have it behind the counter or in the manager's office. Most stores also have it. All pharmacies are carrying it now. And in New Jersey, if you go into a pharmacy and ask for naloxone, if they have a stock in supply, they will give it to you for free. And you can keep this with you if a family member is experimenting with opiates or known to have an opiate addiction, or even a neighbor or somebody that you care about. You don't have to provide your name. I've done this myself. I've gone in to pharmacies to obtain naloxone. And the process, I would say, is a little bit intimidating, even though it shouldn't be. I stood in line like everybody else. I asked for it in front of a crowd of people that were picking up their cold and antibiotic medicines. And then they had to give it to me, explain to me how to use it, and have me sign a form. I signed a fake name. They don't care. They tell you that you can do that as well. And then they filled out the prescription for the naloxone, and they just attributed it to Jane Doe in their system. But there was no counseling that took place other than instructions on how to use it, and certainly no police officers showed up. And so I want you to know should be no stigma in going and getting it again. I've done it myself, and you can do it as well. You probably should if you have any concerns whatsoever. Once you get the naloxone in the box, it does have a shelf life, which you're going to want to pay attention to. But if you needed to use it, you don't want to read the instructions when you need it. You need to know how to use it ahead of time, because seconds literally count here. So the box has 2 doses, and what you would do is you would peel off the foil backing on the 1 dose, and you have the applicator. And once you have this device in your hand, it's very simple to place this end in the nostril of the patient, and you actually have to stick it up into the nostril so that the medicine is going to hit their mucous membranes when you discharge it, and then you're going to put that full dose into 1 nostril. I'm going to play you a video right now so you understand in detail how to use it. The video's only a minute long, and we'll be right back here together where I can review some more details about it.
If you suspect an opioid overdose, check to see if the person will not wake up, is very sleepy, or is not breathing well. Do not test the nasal spray device before use. Narcan nasal spray is for use in the nose only and is safe to use even if opioids are not present. Hold the nasal spray device with your thumb on the bottom of the plunger. Insert the nozzle into either nostril and press the plunger firmly to give the dose. 1 nasal spray device contains 1 dose of medicine. Call 911 immediately after giving Narcan nasal spray. If the person does not wake up, continue to give doses every 2 to 3 minutes until the person wakes up. It is safe to keep giving doses. Stay until an ambulance arrives, even if the person wakes up. You have the power to save a life. For more information, visit Narcan.com.
Okay, so that was quick, simple, and it really is simple. In fact, this is one of the great remedies that anybody could use. It's actually much easier to understand and much simpler than performing CPR. You cannot hurt somebody with naloxone. So if it turns out that they've overdosed on alcohol or some other drug, naloxone is not going to help them, but it cannot hurt them either. There's no reason to fear if they're not overdosing on opiates and you give them naloxone. You will not be injuring them. You can't overdose them on Narcan, and so there's really no reason to hesitate using it. You should know that 1 dose will probably save their life, but only for a matter of minutes. And so calling that ambulance immediately is extremely important. Get that ambulance on the way. The second dose that you have there is in case they overdose again, which typically they will if they've just overdosed recently and you hit them with 1 dose of Narcan. I would say almost every time I've used it, they have a second round. Once the Narcan wears off, the opiates tend to still be in their system, and they might go out again. That's why you've got 2 doses. Let's get the ambulance on the way. You put the second dose in the second nostril. That's if you haven't seen any effect from the first dose. Their heart has to be beating in order for this to work. And if you're a couple seconds too late, it's just going to be too late. However, sometimes there's an application problem where either the nostril is clogged, or if you didn't disperse it correctly and maybe it went on their face instead of up into their nose, that second dose is going to give you the ability to do that and hopefully get a second shot at saving their life. And so that's how you would use the naloxone. It's important for me to note here, when you dispense it, you're looking for a spray like that. So it's a nice firm press of the applicator. You only get 1 shot at it, so don't test it like it's a water gun, okay? You just trust that it's going to come out and you're going to spray it up into their face like that. Any of you can get this anonymously and right now for free in New Jersey. It's not very expensive, even if you have to pay for it, and as a life-saving measure, it's good to have. Before I proceed, our presentation will be coming to an end relatively quickly here, and so I wanted to give you one last chance to submit any questions or comments in the box below this video. You can submit them there, or you can email them to me at tim@timothyshoemaker.com, and Eddie will review them, and I'll have a chance to address them before we close the stream. But I've accomplished most of my objectives here tonight, and you have other things to do. And so that's going to happen pretty quickly here. And there is a delay in the stream, so I want to make sure you have a chance to submit your questions in time for Eddie to review them and me to respond to them before I close out the stream. Now, I digress. Important for you to know that if you do call 911 to report an overdose, in New Jersey, we have overdose immunity. Many states also have this. You can check the state that you're in to confirm whether or not you have it. And if you do call to report an overdose, you should know that the person who is overdosing and you who's making that call, you have immunity from prosecution. And so there should be no fear and no hesitation. If you think somebody needs help from an opiate overdose, don't worry about them getting into trouble. That won't happen. I have mixed feeling on this because almost everybody that I got into treatment from opiate use or other forms of drug use was receiving treatment because they were compelled to get it. Most people will not voluntarily accept treatment. A recent study in Oregon has once again proven that, something we've known for many, many decades. But when it comes to saving a life and preventing an overdose, I think anything that eliminates the fear that you might have of getting them in trouble, trying to solve it on your own, causing a delay in getting emergency responders going. I can understand the purpose for it. So if it makes you feel more comfortable, know at least that if the police come, they probably won't even ask your name. They're going to collect any paraphernalia or drugs that are there, carefully remove it from the scene, and the person who is overdosing is not going to experience any negative legal consequences as a result of them overdosing or you calling to report the overdose. So there should be no obstacle. Now, if getting them in trouble was preventing you from saving their life, that's another issue, right? It should never even be a consideration. But just in case maybe there were some young ones, or you need to explain to your young ones why they definitely need to call if they suspect an overdose, if their fear is that somebody will get in trouble, it shouldn't be a fear. All right, this is what an opiate overdose looks like. If you look up into the corner there, you'll see that the gentleman, his eyes are open, but he the patient doesn't even have time to close their eyes. They lose consciousness and they're just frozen. Unlike someone who's overdosed on alcohol, who's passed out, typically their eyes are closed. It happens a little slower, more gradually. They kind of fall asleep. With the opiates, it kind of just happens quickly. So important for you to know that. If you try to raise somebody, you try to wake them up, and there's various different ways for you to do that, one of which is called the sternal rub. If you rub your knuckles across their sternum and even that doesn't get them to wake up, then they're not just tired, they're having an emergency of some type. And so let's make sure that we get emergency services on the way. And you can see the Narcan applicator there on the ground. So I don't see any comments or questions that are rolling in. I just want to remind you that if you have someone in your life or you encounter someone that you love that does appear to need some form of counseling or assistance with any form of addiction, I think the generalized and best practice for you is to contact your pediatrician for those who are under 18, or maybe your doctor, your family doctor for those who are over. You can also go to a counselor. If your child is in school, I think the student assistance counselor or coordinator is the absolute best place for you to go to start the initiation of services. And you can also consult your insurance company to see what care providers they might give you access to, but don't wait. All right, the quicker you address this, the better of a chance you have of saving their life and instituting healthier habits and behaviors in their life. So, friends, that is my presentation for you here tonight. I do want you to know that if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, we have several different options that you can choose from. If you are with a school or a community that often tries to serve those in your region, we do presentations like this very consistently. Drug prevention, social media use, screen time, prom season, safe celebrations, college safety, and many other things. So if you like what you saw here tonight, feel welcome to indulge in some of those other programs or contact our staff, our team, to book a presentation for your community. We would love to meet you down the road and help service those needs. My friends, God bless you all. Thank you so much for your time. I have been Tim Shoemaker, and on behalf of Eddie and the rest of the team here tonight, I thank you for joining our live stream. Thank you, Heidi Agramonte and the Inglewood Department of Health for helping fund this consequential program. I hope it goes to good use. Good night, guys.